Hi there. I'd like to welcome you into the podcast, second episode of the Cabling Podcast. And we're here today with Peter Jones, Ethernet Chair and Cisco Distinguished Engineer. I knew when we started a podcast, we would have to get the Ethernet Alliance and you on very soon. Pretty much our first guest in our first episode, Patrick and I talked about the brand in the industry, and so now we are so pleased to be here with you. How have you been, Peter?
Actually, I've been really good, Matt. It's been a really weird couple of years. And I recently went back to my office for the first time in a year and a half to pull my big good screen out of there. So it's been odd, but I do a lot of work remotely anyway. So I guess the biggest change has not been not commuting, but also not traveling to standards events and shows. And so I don't miss getting on a plane, but I do miss all the interactions with people.
Same, and that has been a very common refrain that I've heard from others. So since we are here, we must talk about Ethernet Alliance recent news and developments. We've certainly covered a lot on the website. The last
and we do always appreciate your assistance on that.
We're always thrilled to cover the Ethernet Alliance. Bound at the hip. In a way, Ethernet technology is just such a big part of what we cover. So I was just on the cabling on a cabling webcast with some gentlemen from Panduit, and they were talking about this very type of stuff with single peer Ethernet and Ethernet technology, PoE, and one of the statistics that was cited is that in 2019, Power over Ethernet had its best year, biggest and best year ever, and that Ethernet ports are predicted to grow between 11 and 13% a year from here on in, and that kind of leads me to this recent EA announcement about the approval of the PoE certification test equipment and how EA members can now perform Gen 2 and Gen 1 PoE testing in-house. Third-party testing labs can accelerate their rollout of offerings. This can only result in much more power over Ethernet technology flowing into the market. Is that a correct assessment?
I think so. So, I mean, if you think back to when PoE started, it was really designed to deal with IP phones, right? And that was always in a place where you had a fairly competent, qualified IT staff. But as PoE is becoming much more common, right, in all sorts of different places, I've seen a PoE-powered golf ball dispenser and a PoE-powered bar fridge.
Yeah.
So we need to get to the stage where it's much easier for people to deploy that stuff, and that's why I think the PoE certification program is a real step forward. I mean, you see this similarly in things like USB or Wi-Fi Alliance. So I think when you get technology which becomes deployed by everyone, the certification becomes more important. And I think it helps give people the confidence to deploy.
Absolutely. And I was going to go to Voices of Ethernet, but I think we'll go to single pair Ethernet deployments, because we were just talking about that on this webcast with Panduit that I just mentioned. And they were talking a lot about Ethernet-APL, and one of the interesting questions that came in during the session was somebody wanted to know about the difference between power over Ethernet and power over data line. And Mike Vermeer from Panduit pointed out that power over Ethernet doesn't work. It's power over data line is what it's called for SPE, and there's a distinction there. So followers of Cabling Install and CI&M know that we devoted a lot of coverage to the official unveiling of SPE technology. But as long as we had you here, I just wondered if we could get a little bit of an update on how your take on what the pulse of the deployments of SPE has been, and questions I would say that you've heard, like I just mentioned to you about this PoE versus PODL distinction. Can you weigh in on that for us?
There's a lot in there, and so let me try and take it piece by piece. The fundamental, the way that the technology is fundamentally different between 4-pair and single pair, right? And so there's a whole lot of reasons why that is. I'm not exactly the guy to explain it, right? I think you're probably familiar with Chad Jones, who's probably one of the good people to talk to about that, but it is fundamentally different. Now, I'll also point out that we should be a little careful taking standards as brand. So I'll point you out that if you look in the Ethernet standard, right, what we call PoE is actually power over the NDI.
Okay.
Now, what you find is engineers are usually very bad at doing branding. So while power over data line was sort of descriptive and cool because you can make a bunch of jokes about this being a standard poodle, it's not a great brand. So at least at Ethernet Alliance, we're trying to call it more single pair power over Ethernet because it still is power over Ethernet. And I would prefer not to have to explain to people what poodle is.
Yeah.
So that's where we would sort of like to take the branding. We've probably got to do some more work in that, but I think it's a much easier concept to grab onto, and it sort of retains the PoE brand, which I think is really important.
Good thought. Good point to have come out here in this forum. So
there's a bunch of other things that you mentioned in there. You mentioned that the Ethernet-APL project came up. Now, as you probably remember, this is a consortium, isn't quite the right word. This is a combination of a bunch of the top-end process control guys, and they've all decided to adopt single-pair Ethernet as their path forward. As far as I'm aware, they're basically using the data part of the spec from 802.3, and the powering spec is different, and that's basically because they run in intrinsically safe areas, right? So intrinsically safe is you can't have a spark and it can't explode. So they are basing everything they're doing off the 802.3CG, off the data spec.
Okay. Now, when you talk about those guys, are you talking who's installing that in? Is it?
So this is the Rockwells, the Siemens, Anderson Hauser, Pepperell, and Fuchs. So they're the cream of the crop for process control. Now, I think where they are at the minute, they've done some public demos. I don't know how much is actually being installed. If you're familiar with the OT world, it tends to change fairly slowly. These guys are quite conservative.
So to the second part of my question, what has the feedback been from the industry that you have discerned on SPE? Or do people seem to get it? Has there been significant questions? Have a lot of people had the same question for you?
I think there's a lot of interest. I mean, certainly, I've drunk from the Kool-Aid, right? I'm a believer. It's hard to get an industry going. So at the minute, there tends to be a bit of a chicken and egg. There is no one's building switches because no one's building end devices, but no one's building end devices because no one's building switches. What I am hearing is, behind closed doors, right? I know there are some reasonably major companies doing some serious investment in this, but nothing is out there yet. So right now we are still in the pre-launch, the pre-launch phase of product shipment, right? There is conversations, there's things happening, but there isn't a lot of product out there.
Yeah. That has been a question that I've noticed on the webcast. People are asking, where can I get a switch for SPE? Does Cisco make the switch? So
I'm very familiar with the ideas, and what I would suggest is we are always in the case of, in the evangelization side, part of what you need to do is connect the people who want to use it with the people who want to produce it. And so we should have a talk about how we can sort of connect those together, because the reason that companies like Cisco, and I'm not speaking for Cisco today, do things is because we have customers who want them. So often there's a bit of a gap on a new market. There's a bit of a gap between people who would produce and people who would consume. So maybe we can help bridge that market, because what we really need to hear from people is, what are they going to do with it? Now, it's one thing to say, look, I want one to play with, but what I'd really like to hear about, as Ethernet Alliance Chair, is if people could tell me what their vision is or what they want to solve. Because I think the more people we get together with a common vision, the easier it is to get the producers to actually move that path. Does that make sense?
It does. And in my mind, I don't know if this is a useful or correct distinction to make, but I'm sort of looking at the industrial and the smart building enterprise sides as two separate segments for SPE. And it seems to me that it's being more, well, I can't say it's really being more aimed at industrial than it is smart buildings, but is that at all a useful distinction to have, or is it all just kind of flowing into the same market?
So it's partly a useful distinction. Clearly, the most visible things that are happening are the guys in process control. There's always a question about who is more in the OT world, who's more advanced, industrial or building, and I think it's often industrial, but not always. And also, when you think industrial, right, every factory has an IT network, right, a building control network, and a production network, and so they're not as distinct as you think. I don't know who's really going to take off first, but I think it's equally applicable. And I think really what it comes down to is who are the technology providers who first see that this is a key advantage and jump on it. Right? I don't think it necessarily has to be one or the other. Right? They're both similar in scale. I could actually make the argument that it could maybe be buildings, because buildings tend to get major upgrades more frequently.
Good point to keep in mind. One that just occurred to me is, I mean, how far away would we be from a situation where SPE is actually taking up, market share or deployment space of traditional PoE? I mean, are those two technologies
in general? I don't think they're replacements. I mean, the one place you could consider that is there's the move towards, there's more PoE lighting going out there.
Yeah.
But I think you fundamentally build them differently. So I see them very much as complementary technologies, not in competition.
Okay.
I mean, if you want to go and design your building where all of its control is around like an IT cabling structure, fine, go for it. I'm very happy. But if you want to stay with the more traditional OT cabling structures, single pair Ethernet. So I think it really becomes, it is complementary technology, and it really depends how you want to structure your building.
Mm-hmm. I have to ask you about Wi-Fi 6, because it seems like more and more people in the industry are getting that that note about Cat 6A and the two connections that you need to enable Wi-Fi 6, and now we're hearing about Wi-Fi 6.
So now I'm going to get a little skeptical and maybe get myself in trouble.
Okay.
All right. So the vast bulk of access points, I mean, you're seeing a lot of the top-end access points today will come out with 2.5 gig or maybe 5. There is a fundamental limitation on how much heat you can disperse from this big, and it's not that huge. So, I mean, personally, I think that we have a long way to go with 2.5 and 5 gig. Now, if I was recommending someone to look at how to put together a building, and I would be going with the standard recommendations of I would drop 2 Cat 6As to a location, but I'd also do them with a service loop, because my hunch is that you get better performance by putting in 2 access points 5 meters apart than putting in a twice as big access point. Mm-hmm. So, although lots of the industry wants to sell things as very fast, real deployments are sort of different, and so. I'd be pretty comfortable if someone asked me right now saying, yeah, drop 2, where you think the access point's going to be, drop 2 Cat 6As there with a nice long service loop. Right? If it turns out that we can end up building an access point that does 20 gig and needs 140 watts, awesome. If not, we can put 2 and they can be 5 meters apart.
Mm-hmm. It really seems like the carriers and the service providers are hammering Wi-Fi 6. I've seen a lot of news. Wi-Fi 6 mesh.
I mean, we're all okay. So new technologies are exciting. It's like with 5G. I mean, our business tends to focus on new shiny things, and we often ignore the fact of what people are mostly buying and deploying. That being said, Wi-Fi 6 and 6E are going to provide major advantages. And so if I looked in, if we go back to being, as we transition back from all working at home to being more office-based, I'm pretty sure that people are going to be it's going to be more part-time in the office. So it's going to be more open space, shared space. And I think this will accelerate the trend of all the people are going to go wireless. But then again, you're going to keep having a lot of the things are going to be wired, because all these buildings are going to need to be smarter. And then it becomes, you can run your building control on wireless. I mean, you can run it on from legacy wired technologies, right? The backnets, the LonWorks, etc. Most people are trying to move away. You can run all your building automation on wireless, and there's some reasons to do that, but it wouldn't make me comfortable. So I think what you're going to see is the building has to get smarter. So the proportion people go to wireless and things go to wired. That's my guess as to how it works out.
Well, thank you for that. Okay, well, not to make too jarring a transition, but let's go back up to 35,000 feet and talk about the Voices of Ethernet archive and recordings, because I really thought when I heard about it, I thought it was a great project, and to get Mr. Metcalf and the other voices up there initially, I thought that was, I just thought that was great. So I just wanted to ask you about, how you came up with the project there at the with the Ethernet Alliance team, and what the roadmap is. I mean, we're going to have a library now of voices, as you just mentioned, people speaking to technology.
So I can actually claim credit for this idea, because this one was mine, and actually it came through from a bunch of things I've been doing about in different places, and really about how to connect the people who use our technology with the people who build it, right? Because there's a lot of stuff that you don't need to know, but is very nice to know. So you don't need to know how Ethernet is built, but if your life is, if your work reputation is based on it, it's really nice. So what I wanted to do was figure out a way to connect, our customers, our recommenders, more back to the technology, so they felt more comfortable at how and why. And this is sort of the things I tend to do in my talks anyway. And so I had this idea in a few places, and I brought up to Ethernet Alliance and I said, look, here, what I'd like to do is something like StoryCorps, where you basically, are you familiar with StoryCorps, Matt?
No.
Okay, so StoryCorps it's a public foundation. Their whole thing is record oral histories and deposit them in the Library of Congress, and then they curate some of them out. And what I was thinking of is, can we go back and get the people who are instrumental in building Ethernet and get them on a call? And the idea is, half an hour call. It's the chat you might have in a coffee shop or at a bar, right? It's not an oral history like the Computer History Museum would do, where they might do like 2 days worth of recording. So this is supposed to be a chat, so people get some feeling of the context behind what happened.
Yeah.
And so I floated the idea, and people said, that's a great idea, we should make that work, right? And so then I offloaded it effectively to some of the people on the more marketing side and said, look, can we make this a reality? So we came up with a plan, we got a budget, and so then we started asking people. In general, people have asked, most of them have said, yeah, this is a great idea. And we need to capture the stories before people, unfortunately, people who built this stuff are starting to die. And so we want to get the stories from them before they go. Now, if I look forward, I want to make this a much bigger thing. I'd like to connect voices from all over the spectrum, including the original pioneers, people who build the technology today, and eventually people who use it. So the function of Ethernet Alliance is to really promote Ethernet. Now, my opinion has always been that people don't value a technology they don't understand, right? And so you need to help them understand the value. I think the way to do this is to help connect all the things behind it. So for me, this is a way to get that connection between the people who live and breathe the technology with the people who built it.
Understood. I'll tell you one big thing that provided that connection for me personally is the time that Patrick McLaughlin and I took a ride right up the road here in New Hampshire to the University of New Hampshire Interoperability Laboratory, right? Yeah, UNHIOL, and got inside there during I think it was during a Plugfest. This was a long time ago too. I mean, this is more than 5 years ago, but that'll give you an insight into the workings behind the technology, and it kind of leads me to the next question I wanted to ask you about the rescheduled high-speed networking Plugfest that I read about on the Ethernet Alliance site for 2022. Anything to say?
So a lot of the things EA used to do were built around in-person things, right? Be it trade shows or be it Plugfests. and they've all got a lot harder to pull off in pandemic time. So, I mean, we've done a couple of virtual trade shows. I think we were at 1 or 2 Bixies, and it's a very different experience. We did a virtual demo for OFC, because normally OFC would be one of our big shows. We'd take all the latest cool gear and build it and show it off.
Mm-hmm.
So what we did in this case is we basically put together we effectively hot staged something at one of our members' facilities and did a whole bunch of videos. And so we presented this as video collateral instead of physical look and feel, right? Which is not quite so good in some ways, but much better in other ways because it's easier to reuse. Plugfests are a bit more difficult because you absolutely have to have lots of people in the same place.
Yeah. So
we've been trying to figure out what we can do in this because it's still required. We just haven't really cracked the nut on how we would do this, safely. So that's a stay tuned because we know we have to figure it out. I mean, maybe we hit a high enough vaccination rate, but we don't quite know how to pull that off yet.
Right. Yeah. Well, I'm sure, as with a lot of other arenas during this time, where there's a will, there's a way, and but I certainly hope that we'll get back to Plugfest because it'll be more opportunities for us to cover them.
I mean, we need to get back there as an industry because it's really important to have that. We need to test it and make it work before we give it to our customers. And so Plugfests are an essential part of that. So we have to get back there. It's just a question of figuring out when we can do this efficiently and safely and effectively. I mean, we need to get there's a minimum set of people you need, right? A Plugfest with only like 3 vendors is not that interesting. You need to get there's a critical mass.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, if I looked at my company's travel policy, right, I probably would not be allowed to go to one right now.
Right.
And so, this is something we have to work through. I'm not, I don't think we're going to figure out in the next 6 months, maybe afterwards. So I think stay tuned on this. We know we've got to get back to it, but there's a lot of things in the way.
Now, but pre-pandemic, were you in the habit of going to the Plugfest, like up at UNHIOL? You go up there frequently at all? Or?
I haven't so much. There were other people who were closer. I think I may have gone to one. I mean, it's just before the pandemic, I was traveling 10 weeks a year, so I wasn't keen to take on extra trips.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I don't think it's too soon for. Is there anything else Ethernet Alliance related that we absolutely have to discuss?
Absolutely have to discuss. So I guess we've been doing some more outreach. So we do have a every 2-week newsletter that's coming out. You can sign up for that online, where we try and capture some of the most interesting stuff. Okay. There's, as you well know, right, there is multiple ways to get out to people. And so we're trying to do that. We're doing more blogs. We're really trying to figure out, in the absence of the physical contact, the physical shows, how else we can go and reach people. Now, as you well know, right, that's a bit of a challenge, but it's also a benefit. The physical show thing is awesome, but there's only a subset of people who get there. So I think if we can do a better job cracking the virtual connection, right, we'll end up with a much better place. If I go out to the hopefully not that far away future and physical shows come back, we still need to be targeting the people who can't travel to shows, right? Because, I mean, even if I look at, in my employment, right, Cisco Live is a big show, but in the US we get, 30,000 people. Yeah. We have a lot more customers than that. And so, EA has a very broad base. If we can get better at doing, the virtual collateral, the communication, electronic communication, right, we'll be better at serving the market.
Understood. Well, let's talk about cabling photos.
Cabling photos.
We are here now.
It's amazing how much response they get.
Yeah.
And you look at it and you say, well, hang on, why do people care? And people care because they've lived their way through this stuff.
Yeah. The response is incredible and it's so much fun. I mean, all you have to do is go on Twitter and check some of the threads that have been generated.
And it's user-generated content. It's perfect.
Yeah. I mean, I think, Justin Cohen from Cisco, who's been a CI&M presenter, was on this morning showing, a little photo of how his 8-year-old daughter rewired the switch on his desk. I mean, it's there's something universal about the cabling photos. So So I hope on the podcast to make a habit out of this little thing.
So is this the frivolity section of the podcast?
It would be. I've chosen two photos here for cabling triumph versus cabling tragedy, and I have some regrets because I think I could have chosen some better photos. I think we could go on all day here talking about cable fail.
I don't think there is not an answer, right? There's so many variations of what's happened out there, and I mean, I think in general, no one starts off with a plan to build a really crappy system. but like many other things, right? They tend to rot, right? So unless you keep them up, so over time, it's a problem. But we can all take a look at the things which look beautiful, and the really interesting question I think for some of them is, do they still look that beautiful 5 years later?
Yeah, I don't know, and let's do that now because. We're going to get up on the screen our first photo for Cabling Triumph. It's this red beauty of a rack. The caption is, "This is one side of your internet cable and VOD." And this is obviously from one of these, I don't know if it's a carrier or a broadcast type deployment, but I've noticed that these, these cabling sites look like the one we're looking at now. It's almost like utility-esque how perfect they are, and I'll draw your attention to the fact that they appear to be using standard plastic cable ties in this photo. And
so that did come up on when I posted this on Twitter. Someone came back and said cable ties, like they should be using what do you call it here? The other thing,
Velcro.
And then someone else said, well, it's either Velcro or they should do there was a thing they used to do previously, which was they used to do a weave.
Yeah.
Yes, but the cable, I mean, I think we did a poll a while ago, right, about, Velcro versus cable ties. I think Velcro won by quite a long way.
It did, but I don't think cable ties are going anywhere. You see them everywhere, and it seems like in these high-end, there's a guy on Reddit, which is where we draw a lot of these photos from on social media to talk about and report on. But there's a guy on Reddit who apparently works for CBS, broadcast in New York, and he posts these, these cabling photos, and you see a lot of plastic cable ties. I mean, I think they put them on there. They think.
I think this is like is basketball or NFL better, right? I think this is just I'm clearly not in a position to comment, right? I think it's, as we all know, right, cable ties you can get very tight and clean, and they're a real pain if you have to move anything. But I think, in this case, the red, you look at the work and the work is awesomely beautiful, right? It just flows. You look and you go, you can see where everything is. Now,
yeah.
I don't know what happens if you have to do some sort of change in this. It will be interesting to find out what the result is if you have a problem with one of the cables in the middle.
Yeah, I mean, I can only think that somebody with nimble fingers and some snips goes in there and just does it. They're certainly not leaving it like the next photo, the cabling tragedy. This was submitted by a CI&M reader, which is always awesome. And I'll read the caption: "Who needs a rack when you have a shelf and power strips?" I can only take the submitter's word that this is how it was left and was intended to operate. It looks like they were in the middle of something for this, but
it looks horrendous. And it looks like, oh God, I want to scream and run away.
And as bad as it looks, obviously it's incredibly common. You see a lot of this out there in the field. So, it's just entropy, right? And
yeah, it is entropy. Things rot on the shelf, and you see this all the time. There is always the temptation for people to go, "I'll just make this change, and it'll be okay." And so, yeah, there's the question of how long does it go before someone says, "No, I can't live with that anymore."
Yeah. I mean, there's one thing that has been a theme of our talks, Peter, is, and I know you always like to talk about the story. There's always a story involved, with technology and these discussions that we have about ICT and cabling. And, there are definitely some stories behind these photos. course, how.
I seem to remember one from a while ago, where someone had a small rack actually hanging off the ceiling via a Cat5 cable.
Yeah,
it was terrifying.
Yes. Well, we could do this all day. I don't know, maybe for future installments of Cabling Triumph versus Cabling Tragedy, I should, queue up, another set of photos for us to talk about. But yeah, this one, who needs a rack when you need when you have a shelf and power strips, was a gem.
And I'm still looking behind it, and there's the stuff hanging on the plywood wall, and there's a little cabinet there that's sitting open. It's just like,
yeah. And I mean, and you see, the switch is just, it's got a lot of cabling in it. So, I mean, this is, obviously a fairly large office space. So anyway, the joys of cabling photos, we could go on all day, and perhaps we should, I guess we'll have to wait until a future sit down with you, hopefully pretty soon. It's thank you so much for joining us.
It's always a pleasure, Matt. I really enjoy talking to you folks, and I really like the opportunity to reach the people that you reach. Because the reality is the foundation of my industry is the cabling plant. And I see this as an asset that we don't talk about enough. And so without the people you get to talk to, right, my business wouldn't exist. Simple as that.
Well put. We'll let you have the last word. We'll leave it there. Peter Jones, Ethernet Alliance Chair, thanks again for joining us here at cablinginstall.com.
You're very welcome, Matt, anytime.